Hello and welcome to the Game Master How-To series. Today we are going to teach you how to paint a dungeon, and we're going to show you how to paint and create these realistic and simple dungeon tile pieces using all of the parts inside of the Game Master Dungeons and Caverns core set. Before we begin painting, we need to build and prep our dungeon tiles. To start, you're going to sand the surface. This is going to allow all of the texture and paint to adhere to it a little bit simpler. Using the ruler included in the Game Master set, you're going to mark off 1-inch tile markings with a pencil, and then you're just going to score the tile marks with the scenery knife included in the box set. Now we're just scoring this, we're not cutting all the way through, because this is just going to be a guide for us to help to build the texture on the tiles. Now we're going to go ahead and create perpendicular lines using the same technique, 1 inch apart. And again, we're just scoring the foam here. We're not cutting all the way through. Once we've scored the lines, you can just take a normal graphite pencil and reinforce those tiles by tracing those scored lines we made with the scenery knife. By using the graphite pencil, you're adding additional depth and realism to these tile pieces for your dungeon scenery setup. To add texture and increased realism, take an old rock or a brick like we have that we found laying around the headquarters and press it into the foam. This is going to mimic the shape and the texture of the rock to give it a unique and very realistic rocky appearance. You can go back in with your graphite pencil and just draw in a couple cracks and creases along these dungeon tiles to give it a weathered and aged appearance. Now with your scenery knife, you can go ahead and cut all the way through the foam in 2 or 3 simple passes, and this is where you start to build your modular pieces for your scenery setup. Now take a bit of your XPS scenery foam glue and you're just going to apply a couple random dabs of this to the dungeon tiles. We're going to be adding some rocks a little bit later on. You can take a brush to just move those around and give it a more realistic and randomized appearance. Using the scenery sand, we're just going to sprinkle a little bit of this on top of the areas where we applied the glue. This is going to give us some nice randomization to our dungeon tiles. Once it's had time to adhere, you go ahead and shake off the excess before using our scenery primer that you can find inside the box set. This is 100% water-based and safe to use on your foam. It's going to give a nice base coat to the foam for you to begin applying other paints to. It won't dissolve the foam. Again, this was specifically designed for use with this XPS foam. When you're finished spraying, go ahead and turn the can upside down, activate the nozzle, and spray until pigment no longer sprays. This will help to clean the nozzle for future painting projects. Using Dungeon Gray from the Game Master box set, we're going to apply an overbrush to these tiles. It's very similar to a dry brush, but you're not going to remove any of the excess paint, but you are going to apply this in a very similar fashion as a dry brush with just a little bit more paint on the bristles. This is going to give you a nice gray base tone. Using Dungeon Highlights, we're going to apply this to our palette, and this time we're going to apply a finer dry brush. You see that we're pulling away some of the paint from the brush, and we're just going to lightly flick the bristles of the dry brush across the raised areas of the model to add some highlights and dimension to them. Now with Dungeon Effects, we're going to apply an even more refined highlight. We're going to remove a little bit more of that paint from the bristles of the brush, and we're very lightly going to trace this and flick this over the raised areas to really give it some nice highlights. Now we're going to apply some cavern highlights to our palette, and we're going to take our wash brush that's included. We're just going to lightly color in those rocks that we applied in the earlier stages. In a similar fashion as we did with the grays, we're going to apply some Cavern Effects to our dry brush, and we're very lightly going to apply this across the raised areas of the rocks on our tile base. We're going back to our Dungeons Effects. This is a nice bright white color paint, and we're going to apply this in a very similar fashion as we did on the gray areas, but we just want to apply this very sparingly across the tips of the rocks to add a more refined and final highlight to them. Next, we're going to recommend you apply a bit of our subterranean wash to your palette, and we're just going to apply this around the edges and very differently than we would normally apply a wash to a model. We're just going to apply this into the recesses and areas of interest to give it a molded and aged appearance. Once that wash has had time to dry, we're going to add a little bit more of our XPS foam glue to our palette. When taking a pair of tweezers from the Army Painter tool range, we're going to take some Dungeon Tufts. We're going to apply a little bit of that foam glue to the bottom of the tuff and then apply it randomly to areas on our dungeon tile. If you've been following along to these simple steps, you've just learned how fun and easy it can be to create your own dungeon tile system with the Game Master Dungeons and Caverns core set.